You know, I find the battle analysis series on the channel to be a particularly good avenue for exploring older portions of the story, as it really allows for an in-depth dive into those chapters and events. In our last battle analysis video, we looked at Ichigo, Kenpachi, and Byakuya versus Yami, the final fight to take place in Wako Mundo, the final battle to involve an Espada, and what should have been a palpable, epic confrontation. As described in that video though, the fight is mostly just dumb fun from start to finish. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, and in fact there are some cool moments for sure, and Yami had an interesting design at least, but the fight never quite lived up to the gravitas of its position within the narrative. You could see the battle playing out in front of you, sure, but you never felt any real weight from it. In today's battle analysis, we're going to go in the opposite direction. The fight that occurs almost immediately after Yami's rampage is a hefty, powerful, emotional duel, and one of my personal absolute favourite fights in the entire series. Komamura and Hisagi versus Tōsen is the culmination of one of the most underrated subplots in Bleach, the star-crossed coming together of two sides destined to clash, two sets of ideals set on an inescapable collision course that's hurtling to the finish line. Once the fight began, both sets of warriors knew in their hearts that this was inevitable in the end, that conflict was the only way to settle their otherwise irreconcilable worldviews. From the moment Komamura and Hisagi confided in one another before the grave of Tōsen's dear friend, for whom he set upon his blood-soaked path of justice, they were resolved to bring him back to them, no matter the cost. It's here that Kubo really flexes his character writing muscles. The dialogue is absolutely top-notch as Komamura and Tōsen trade barbs, their perspectives clear but their differences even more so. The gulf in their ideologies is a chasm, and yet their back and forth feels meaningful, it feels understandable. It feels like, despite that unmanageable difference, that they might have stood a chance at reaching one another. Both sides stand teetering on a precipice, yet at the same time you can see where both of them are coming from. Tōsen might be the antagonist, even the villain in this scenario, but this fight paints him as a truly tragic figure, who has allowed a painful darkness to encroach upon and consume him, and it's slowly eating away at him from the inside, while manifesting upon him on the outside in real time as the battle progresses. The imagery then is stellar, the stakes are high. It's a near-perfect Bleach fight, at least in my opinion. And so I'm very excited to discuss it. It's been a long time coming. At last, one of the three major villains of the Arrancar arc, and really the entire series, gets his chance to shine. But for as good as I think this fight is, what would I have done differently, if anything? Is it a fitting battle for one taking place at the climax of the series' longest arc? How does it compare to the Espada battles that came before? We'll talk about all of that and more in today's video, so settle in and enjoy. Let's take a look at Komamura and Hisagi versus Tōsen in the Fate Karakura Town arc. So, right there I just mentioned that the stakes are high in this fight. But what does that really mean? That's where I want to begin with today's battle, because it's the crux of the entire conflict, the question, what really is at stake here? Karakura Town, of course, on a macro level, as is the same for every fight taking place during this arc, that will always be the bigger picture. But there's a lot more bubbling beneath the surface in this particular battle that's always made it stand out to me. Emotionally, there are a lot of things at stake, things that aren't tangible, that you can't see. Closure of a friendship that's now totally untenable and perhaps always was. The desire to bring a man to justice who has not only eluded it so far, but even preaches it himself. But most importantly, above all else, this is a battle for Tōsen's own soul, an eternal tug-of-war that plays out right before us. As he continues to find himself heading down a darker path, Komamura and Hisagi struggle endlessly to push back against it. Although Yami's fight is technically still ongoing by the time this battle begins, what we didn't know then, though we probably could have surmised it easy enough, was that we were now officially done with the Espada. With Aizen's betrayal of Harabel in the rearview mirror and his impending duel with Shinji about to begin, we had now entered the very final stages of the fake Karakura Town battle, and it is time for the trio of main villains to step up to the plate. The first up is, unsurprisingly, Kaname Tōsen, the former captain of the 9th Division, who always felt like something of a third wheel to the Aizen and Gin relationship. Where Gin often felt like perhaps the only person who could stand anywhere close to Aizen, Tōsen was more of the traditional follower. A zealot who bowed to Aizen and decorated him with the title of Lord. To Gin, Aizen was never anything more than his captain, but to Tōsen, Aizen was a god. I'll be giving Kubo his flowers a lot throughout this video, but I do have to give him a lot of credit where this fight is due, and not just for its sheer quality, but for the way Kubo stuck to his guns here as an author. The simple, unattractive truth is that neither Komamura nor Tōsen are very popular characters at all, no matter what I might say about Komamura. And yet, with Tōsen as one of the principal villains of the arc, there needed to be resolution to his role in a way that was satisfying and meaningful, and I love that Kubo spent the requisite amount of time and effort on the battle regardless, and delivered an incredible bout as a result. That being said, if I have any criticisms of this fight at all, it's that I think it is just a little bit too short. With a chapter lifespan running from chapter 383 to 387, you can see it's really not very long. And to make matters worse, while technically unbroken, it runs concurrent with Shinji's battle against Aizen, and the two fights intermingle at times, cutting this fight's screen time down even more. It's a tough situation to be in, because while I would have liked this battle to be even just 1 or 2 chapters longer, especially since I think Tōsen really deserved that as one of the series' primary antagonists, I also kind of think it might be a perfectly paced Bleach fight too. It just feels like a rock and a hard place situation where I don't really know what I want. The fight doesn't overstay its welcome, which is absolutely crucial, but at the same time, I would have liked for it to have stuck around a little bit longer. Compared to the Espada battles found throughout the arc, this is, I think, shorter than every single one of them save for Byakuya vs Zomari. Even Rukia vs Aranero clocks in at just over 7 chapters long, which is impressive. Now, the length of a fight absolutely isn't the be-all and end-all, but this is where events and sequences in the arc begin to feel a little truncated due to Kubo's time restraints kicking in. As such, this fight is almost abnormally short on action. Instead, the drama comes from the clashing of relationships. Truthfully, this fight isn't really about the action scenes, though it does have a couple of good pieces of choreography which we'll get to. But it's almost more of a verbal duel between former allies, where their beliefs are laid bare on the table for all to see. Regarding the fight's length, later on in the video I'll briefly detail an additional exchange I'd have liked to have seen take place at the start of the battle. A chance to give Komamura an epic moment before the fight spirals out of his control, and a chance to see Tōsen's bankai one last time in the series, giving us a little piece of additional action to get things moving. Honestly though, in many ways, this fight is a lot more straightforward to address than fights like the last one we looked at, because there's very little controversial about it. It's straight up just an excellent battle. But considering the seeds of this battle are planted way back in the Soul Society arc, and so it's one of the few Arrancar arc fights that comes with preordained emotional baggage, it seems to me that it would be impossible for there to not be some kind of anticipation. I know I was looking forward to it, to seeing their eventual face-off, to see how these characters interacted with and responded to one another after so long, though I also remember being surprised when the fight came around. Not only because it came around as quickly as it did, but with such little fanfare. What do I mean when I say that? Well, there's a very nice bit of build-up for the fight when the Vizard first arrive, but after that, this fight just kind of begins. We'll get there, but for now, let's move on to look at who's actually involved in the fight. So, who is involved? Really, the main character of this battle, if you will, is likely the enemy, Kaname Tōsen. I feel like Tōsen doesn't get a lot of appreciation as far as Bleach characters go, but I genuinely think he is one of the series' best written antagonists. Now, that doesn't mean that Kubo couldn't have done something slightly better where he's concerned, but on the whole, this character is a complete success. He's very similar to Komamura by design. His ultra-serious nature and moral grandstanding make him a tough sell to the general audience, and he's not particularly fun in a series that thrives on the eccentricity of its amazing cast. But take a step back, and you'll see one of the most compelling villainous arcs in Bleach. Tōsen's motives for joining Aizen, or more accurately, for being with Aizen from the very beginning, are fleetingly hinted at during the Soul Society arc, from his deathbed flashback in his battle against Zaraki, to his parting words to Komamura as he ascended towards Waco Mundo. But this fight really dives into what made Tōsen the man he is today, and why this battle is taking place at all. Tōsen intrigues me a lot as a villain because he is a product of the Soul Society's extremely dubious morality. I wish we'd actually spent a little bit more time with him because we know that the powers that be within the Soul Society and the Gotei 13 completely failed Tōsen in a terrible miscarriage of justice, propping up the nobility and the aristocracy on the backs of the innocent without a care in the world. But Tōsen infiltrated the Shinigami and spent years plotting to destroy them from the inside. And I like this a lot because the Shinigami made Tōsen the monstrous villain he is today. But what's cool about this fight is the way Tōsen's character is pushed to the extreme. One of the major points of this fight is the question of whether or not we as readers can empathise with Tōsen's plight. And as audience members, the answer should be yes. Tōsen's friend was brutally murdered and the Soul Society basically swept it under the rug because, as Can't Fear Your Own World reveals, Tokinada was a member of a high-ranking noble house. But the question that follows is equally pertinent. Does Tōsen's plight excuse what he's become? And that's the emotional quarrel that Komamura and Hisagi must wrestle with as they battle what their fallen friend and mentor has turned into. Speaking of which, on the opposing side, there's SAJIN Komamura and SHUHEI Hisagi. Two Shinigami with strong personal bonds to Tōsen, both of whom had different relationships with the man, both of whom represented two different sides of the Shinigami to Tōsen, and both of whom deal with the fight in slightly different ways. Let's begin with Komamura, as I think his inclusion in this battle is simply a lot more straightforward. As a captain, it feels like his duty to take Tōsen down, to set all personal feelings aside and act in the best interests of the mission. The main question surrounding Komamura is he capable of doing that? Is he capable of putting those feelings aside? There's an interesting thought in there too. Would any of the other captains have tried to fight Tōsen at any point during this battle, or do you think they essentially agreed to leave him to Komamura? Obviously Komamura quite literally jumps at the chance to engage him, but I do wonder if Tōsen was really on anyone else's radar. I mean, you have to assume he was, considering he was one of the three traitorous captains and one of the commanders of the Arrancar. But Komamura's great because for all of his stoicism, he really is the heart of this fight, no pun intended. He's just trying to reach his friend amidst all the darkness, and his unyielding tolerance in the face of seething hate is commendable. Then there's Hisagi, whose inclusion is definitely more interesting. Of the three vice captains that once served the now turncoat captains, Hisagi really is the only one capable of standing up to his former mentor. I remember when Hisagi killed Tōsen, people were suddenly afraid that this was going to now be the outcome for both Gin and Aizen, that they would be taken down in the same way. Of course, those theories were fairly quickly dashed when Hinamori was brutally removed from the fight a few chapters down the line. But of the three, Hisagi does feel fitting. Despite his great admiration for Tōsen, he was the only one who was able to get back on his feet and keep working almost as if nothing happened, keep pushing forward with some level of maturity while shouldering the burden of the division on his back. Even if Tōsen's departure did hit hard, Hisagi was able to keep it together. He's always felt like the most mature of the three betrayed vice-captains, and ironically had by far the smallest amount of screen time of them until the Fate Karakura Town arc. I think Hisagi is handled pretty well in this fight too. He gets involved in what feels like a realistic capacity, despite being clearly nowhere near strong enough to actually face Tōsen. What I like most about this setup, though, is that everyone involved truly has a reason to be there. Now, it doesn't always have to be that way in fights. In fact, there are several examples in the Fate Karakura Town where that isn't so. For example, while it's not really fair to do so, let's compare this fight to one like Love and Rose versus Stark. It's cool, it's flashy, it's mostly designed to be a showcase of what the Vizards can do, but these characters don't know each other at all or have any prior history whatsoever. At least with round 2 fights like Hachi and Soifon versus Baragon, that builds on an already established round 1 fight between Soifon and Baragon in a nice way. By the way, that's exactly how fights like Toshiro versus Kangdu and Soifon versus BG9 should have been handled. A round 2 fight that follows on from what's already taken place, that now involves the inclusion of another character against a resurgent Sternritter. But this fight setup trumps all of those. So let's take a look at some of the pre-fight context that leads us into the main event. As the Vizards arrive on the scene to assist the struggling Gotei 13 in their battle against Aizen and his top 3 Espada, Shinji Hirako lunges for his former vice-captain, attempting to cut off his head with a single strike. His blade comes dangerously close to meeting its mark, but suddenly another one cuts swiftly into view, the glint of the sword's edge screaming towards Shinji's eye. The Vizard manages to avoid the attack at the last second, diving backwards out of the way as Tōsen swings his Zanpakuto in a huge arc, cleaving through the air. Interestingly, Tōsen appears to be right-handed most of the time, yet he swings at Shinji with his left hand, implying to me that this was a very last-minute effort, suddenly realizing his master was in imminent danger. Here's a very quick, mostly unrelated thought. If Shinji had landed his hit successfully on Aizen, would the Hogyoku have tried to fix him up then and there, like it does when struck by Ichigo's Getsuga Tensho? Because as we see later on, the Hogyoku is already protecting Aizen from injury, even before it's begun to truly understand his soul. But anyway, we're getting off topic. Shinji escapes backwards, leading Tōsen to muse that he missed his target. Shinji reveals that he was in fact hit, though just barely above his eye, and mockingly chastises Tōsen for being a mere underling. When Tōsen moves to try and attack him again, however, an enormous form comes between them. Komamura arrives, blocking Tōsen's sword with his armoured arm, sparks flying everywhere. Kubo always gives Komamura the coolest entrances, often using the captain's gigantic size to create an epic sense of scale all of a sudden as he towers over everything else. While Tōsen is shocked that his old friend has appeared before him, I love that Komamura doesn't immediately address him. Merely he glares down at him for a moment before deciding to speak to Shinji instead. It feels like Komamura's disappointment is immense, as if currently he doesn't even have the words to say to Tōsen. You can imagine that Komamura has probably played this moment over and over again in his head, but now that it's here, it's all happened so quickly. So instead, Komamura declares his intention to assist the Vizard, even though they are completely unknown to him. Again, Komamura's good nature shines through here. His first instinct is to come to someone else's defense, and then talk about how he wants to aid them before even getting into a fight. As everyone then breaks off into their individual battles, Komamura and Tōsen stand alone amidst a rain of blood in a really awesome visual. While Komamura says that he never imagined the day would come when he would be forced to block Tōsen's sword in order to protect someone, Tōsen rebukes him, saying he always knew the day would come when they would have to fight to the death. Lifting his blade, Tōsen asks if Komamura is ready, when suddenly Kazushini comes spinning into view, wrapping itself around Suzumushi, the chain rapidly whirring. Stepping up to the plate, Hisagi apologises to Komamura and asks to be allowed to join the fight. Although Hisagi stands tall, Komamura is concerned. The boy is heavily sweating, barely recovered from the crushing beating he took from Aion. But even if Komamura was worried for Hisagi, there's no way he'd ever insult his honour by telling him to step aside. This is something they swore they'd do together. Hisagi calmly confronts Tōsen, calling him captain, alerting Komamura. This isn't the first time one of the vice-captains has referred to their former captain in such a way. Hinamori does the same thing regarding Aizen upon her arrival on the battlefield, which worries Matsumoto. The difference here is that Hisagi is of sound mind, and so him calling Tōsen captain is a conscious decision on his part. And despite accepting what Tōsen has become and being resolute in his desire to open his eyes, Hisagi still finds value in the lessons Tōsen taught him. Hisagi tells Tōsen that he's here to thank him, to which Tōsen replies that Hisagi has grown wise before wondering if he's instead being sarcastic. But he's not. Hisagi is truly grateful for everything the traitor once taught him. But there's more to it than that as well. Looking up at his former captain, Hisagi stands firm, saying that thanks to everything Tōsen has taught him, he'll bring him back to the Soul Society. Of course, to Tōsen, this is an absurdity, and in many ways it is. The notion that Hisagi could really have any effect at all when he knows so little about the truth is folly. Honestly, among this trifecta, Hisagi is the character that I feel the sorriest for. He thought he knew his captain, in fact he still does, but there's a whole other side to Tōsen that Hisagi has literally only the tiniest idea about. Tōsen betraying the Soul Society gave Hisagi a glimpse behind the curtain at who his captain really is, but Tōsen has lived an entire life prior to Hisagi coming into it, where he's being driven by a hunger for revenge. Tōsen scoffs that Hisagi hasn't changed as he activates his Zanpakuto Suzumushi, the blade vibrating, loosening Kazushini's chains. I'm just going to be honest, I've never really been sure what Suzumushi's ability actually is, or really even what its Shikai is. I think it's just the power to generate vibrations and then those sounds have different effects. For example, in the Soul Society arc, Tōsen knocks Uryu out by releasing his Zanpakuto, which is something we never see again. But here, the sword just vibrates. Obviously, it's all to do with Tōsen's cricket theme and the idea of them rubbing their legs together to generate sound, but it's never been hugely clear-cut. Tōsen then tells Hisagi that he once taught him that those that don't know fear have no right to wield their blade in battle, before ominously telling Hisagi that he hasn't changed and that there wasn't a shred of fear in his words. Now, this is an interesting little segment to leave off on before we return to the fight later on. On the one hand, it seems like Tōsen is simply trying to rattle Hisagi, throwing his own teachings back in the boy's face. Of course, during his fight with Findor, we see Hisagi espousing this very same adage to the Arrancar, but perhaps the idea here is to shake Hisagi by making him think he's been wrong about himself all this time. On the other hand, it seems to me like Tōsen is trying to say that Hisagi has gotten a little too big for his boots. Who is he to come here and confront him with his chest out and his head held high? In Tōsen's presence, perhaps Hisagi should be more afraid than he outwardly appears to be. Oddly though, this line from Tōsen doesn't make a lot of sense to me when you consider the flashback we get a little bit later on. Tōsen says that Hisagi hasn't changed, implying he's never had any fear, but we know for a fact that Hisagi came to him explicitly about his crippling fear of battle, so that is a little weird. I will say that for as much as I love this fight, I can't help but think this would have been even more emotionally resonant had we seen a little more of Tōsen and Hisagi working together during the Soul Society arc, but there you go. But with the stage now set, we don't return to this fight again for about 15 chapters or so, as the remaining Espada are dealt with. Before we actually get to the fight though, I always thought that Kensei would find a way to join in somehow. Obviously, he eventually becomes Hisagi's captain, but it's a little weird that Hisagi acknowledges his arrival and then they never speak on screen until the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Perhaps Kensei simply isn't the type to carry a grudge, or maybe he saw Komamura and Hisagi already squaring up to Tōsen and figured he'd leave them be, but either way I remember expecting him to join at some point. I guess it's likely that Hisagi doesn't even really know who he is at this point, he just remembers him as being the Shinigami that saved his life, and the inspiration for his tattoo, because Kensei wouldn't have even been around for very long after that moment, so it's highly likely that Hisagi only recognises him and doesn't yet know who he even really is. When we return to the fight proper in chapter 383, they don't appear to have moved, though I believe the implication is that they have been fighting ever since. As Tōsen notices Aizen stepping into the fray for the first time, he tells Komamura and Hisagi that Aizen's presence here means they now must fight with their true powers. Firstly, I am surprised that Komamura and Hisagi don't have anything to say about Tōsen's zealotry. Aren't they the least bit curious as to why Tōsen seems to heavily worship this man, to the point where he actually refers to him as Lord Aizen in the same manner as the Espada, when until recently Aizen was just another captain like the rest of them? But as Komamura says that he too would like them to fight with bankai, Tōsen coldly shuts him down, as we get one of the craziest cliffhangers of the arc, confirming many readers' suspicions. As Tōsen tells Komamura that Aizen has given him a power far greater than bankai, Komamura looks on in dismay as Tōsen lifts a hand to his face. It's an awesome way to close out the first chapter, and it immediately paints a picture of the direction this fight is going to go. I do think it's a bit of a shame that we don't get to see Tōsen's bankai one last time, and that's where my additional scene comes in, which could play out as follows. As the fight begins, before choosing to use holification, Tōsen immediately activates bankai instead, telling Komamura he's about to enter a world of zero understanding. As Komamura is enveloped within the darkness of Tōsen's bankai, however, he too activates bankai from within, and the gigantic warrior rises up, bursting out of the black dome and shattering it completely as it falls away from his back. I'm just being greedy, really. This would artificially extend the fight and ultimately get us to the same place anyway. But it would have been cool to see Tōsen's bankai one last time, as well as give Komamura an awesome moment early on, but I digress. For Tōsen's character the way he is now, of course the way the canon events play out does make more sense. He's ready to throw away his Shinigami self at this point, though not quite ready enough that he felt he was above using Suzumushi to escape Kazushini early on. But yeah, I mean, it can't be understated how big of a moment this really was. I'd speculated for years, just on my own time, that Tōsen was going to have a hollow mask of his own, though my theories also extended erroneously to both Gin and Aizen, as did a lot of people, to be fair. But as we move into chapter 384, titled Can't Fear Your Own Sword, now, why does that sound so familiar? The fight gets going for real. Tōsen activates his holification, conjuring a massive blast of wind and energy in a spiral around himself. I love the differing responses Komamura and Hisagi have to the transformation. Komamura is enraged, snarling that Tōsen has fallen far in his eyes, while Hisagi's reaction is much more contained. If anything, he seems to be concerned for the man he once looked up to and can't quite believe his eyes. But as the smoke clears, Tōsen is revealed in a full-page shot, and, well, he certainly looks different. To be honest, his hollow mask looks a little suspect, if anything, but all kidding aside, the hollow mask is totally plain, save for a single slit running over the top and down the centre. The mask's design is a clear reference to Tōsen's blindness, but the single slot down the middle, in my opinion, likely refers to how narrow-minded Tōsen's view of the world has become. This newfound power and lust for revenge has swallowed him up, and now that's all he can see. And so that's reflected in this mask. Tōsen is closed off to the world, save for that one thin crack. Other than that though, the blank white mask denotes a certain purity, and we'll see that begin to corrupt in real time over the course of the battle. Not only that, but Tōsen's hollowification is more than just a mask. It's a full-on helmet that encloses his entire head, much more reminiscent of Ichigo's horned hollow mask than any other hollow mask we've seen before. But what's perhaps even more interesting than Tōsen's hollow mask, however, is his new armoured shoulder pads and chest plate. Stretching from under his mask's chin, Tōsen's upper half has been totally consumed by hollowification. We've never seen this before. None of the Vizard can produce armoured plating like this. The implication is clear then. Where the Vizard were unwitting experiments which Aizen now mockingly calls failed Arrancar, Tōsen is the real deal. Tōsen is the complete evolution, the end result of Aizen's hollowification experiments. A more perfect fusing of Shinigami and hollow powers, though not quite on the level of an actual natural mixing like we looked at in our Dangai Ichigo video. I only wish we'd actually seen it. That would have been an incredible flashback to witness, watching as Aizen transformed Tōsen into something new. Unable to believe what he's seeing, Hisagi questions if Tōsen is really using hollowification. When Tōsen confirms it, Hisagi asks why, but in a great arcing motion he's suddenly slashed as Tōsen appears immediately before him, severing Kazashini's chain in two and cleaving into Hisagi's shoulder. By the way, as Can't Fear Your Own World revealed that the true essence of Hisagi's Zanpakuto lies in its chain, if it's shattered like it is here, does that mean Kazashini no longer has the power to save Hisagi from fatal injury? Anyway, the move happens so quickly that Hisagi can't comprehend what's just happened to him. Blinking, he's dumbstruck as blood erupts from his wound. Komamura launches into battle with a roar, activating his Shikai one of the few times we see it in the series, and bringing Tenken's enormous blade down upon Tōsen. In a nice bit of choreography, Tōsen lazily blocks Tenken with his own Zanpakuto, shocking Komamura. Twisting round, Tōsen then plants his leg into Komamura's side with a mighty kick, sending the captain rocketing down to the ground. Tōsen is moving so quickly at this point that we see he takes down Komamura in the same time it took for Hisagi to drop to the streets below. One thing that's interesting about this is the way both Aizen and Tōsen become noticeably more physical and animated upon acquiring their new hybrid power, with both of them suddenly leaping, spinning, and kicking more than before. As if trying to find hypocrisy in Komamura's words and therefore make it easier to pick apart his arguments later, Tōsen muses that the Gotei 13 consider Ichigo their friend, despite him also having the ability to hollowify. Why then does Komamura despise Tōsen for acquiring the same power? To be honest, the answer seems fairly obvious to me, but Komamura, rising from the rubble of a building, replies anyway. He notes that while Ichigo had no choice in his hollowification, Tōsen did, and that despite being remarkably strong already as a Shinigami, he still willingly turned down a darker path. It's interesting to me hearing Komamura's take on Ichigo's powers. The Gotei 13 know about his hollowification and they are seemingly alright with it, but only on the basis that Ichigo had no choice regarding it. Choice seems to be the key metric here, making a decision based on your own merit. Perhaps that's also why the Gotei 13 was willing to let the Vizard return to their old posts in the end. As Komamura calls Tōsen depraved, the hollowified Shinigami merely wonders what's so depraved about a Shinigami becoming more like a hollow, claiming that to be a simplistic judgment from one who sees all hollows as bad and all Shinigami as good. It's an interesting point, though Tōsen comes across as very haughty and sanctimonious in this sequence, desperate to poke holes in Komamura's argument. But still, he is right to a degree, and of course, no one hates the Shinigami more than Tōsen, making it pretty clear that isn't a judgment he himself believes in. But Tōsen seems to believe that Komamura's viewpoint is also a basic one. that Tōsen himself is only power hungry, and that his personal quest doesn't serve a higher purpose. Tōsen, of course, acquired this power for several reasons. To seek revenge against the Gotei 13 and assist Aizen in helping bring it down, yes, but also to distance himself from the Shinigami he so despises. But he thinks Komamura is only angry with him for seeking greater power in the first place, only to be shocked when Komamura reveals he doesn't care about the power at all. No, what Komamura finds depraved is Tōsen's betrayal of his friends and comrades, people who cared about him, in order to seek excessive power. Now, if Tōsen hadn't betrayed everyone and still found a way to holofy, would Komamura really be alright with it? Perhaps not, but the message here is clear. It's not the holofication that Komamura finds disgusting, but Tōsen's treatment of those closest to him. In my opinion, this tracks perfectly with Komamura's character as we know it. This seems to get through to Tōsen briefly as he softly mutters his friend's name, only to suddenly find Kazushini looping over him, the chain wrapping around his neck and yanking him down to a nearby building, slamming Tōsen onto a rooftop underneath. Pinning his captain down with Kazushini pointed directly at him, Hisagi gets the chance to finally question Tōsen's motives himself. Tōsen believes he was too soft, letting Hisagi off with minor wounds, but Hisagi says he, in fact, dodged Tōsen's strike with a half step backwards. Turning another of Tōsen's teachings back on him, Hisagi reveals it was Tōsen who taught him to be ready for any attack once you've drawn your blade. As Hisagi talks with Tōsen, we're given a brief glimpse into the past. Here, Tōsen is a captain while Hisagi is just a seated officer, a time period we've not seen before. Tōsen has a brand new look here too, one that I actually think is pretty great. In fact, Tōsen has had a ton of appearances throughout the series. He's probably on par with Mayuri, to be honest. In every time period Tōsen appears in, he has both a new hairstyle and some kind of new eye covering, but it's handy because it helps us keep track of what era it is. This is likely before Everything But the Rain, as Tōsen not only looks different, but he mentions to Hisagi that everyone makes mistakes in the beginning, implying to me that Hisagi has only really just become an officer. Anyway, Hisagi calls Tōsen out to the cliffside in order to speak with him. First of all, I wonder how many captains would heed their seated officer's call like this. Like I said, Hisagi isn't even a vice captain at this point. But Tōsen comes regardless to hear him out, and I find it interesting that he'd be truly willing to help other Shinigami considering how much he despises them. To me, that sort of quality is indicative of the fact that somewhere deep within, away from all the corruption, Tōsen is inherently a good person who was destroyed by the injustices inflicted upon him. In the flashback, Hisagi asks to be dismissed as a seated officer. Tōsen wonders if this is due to a mistake Hisagi made in a drill the day before, but Hisagi says it wasn't a mistake that made him falter. He was scared. Hisagi reveals that he was wounded by a massive hollow during his time in the academy, hence the vertical claw mark scars on his face, and ever since that day, he's been absolutely terrified of fighting. He always emotionally takes a step back whenever he draws his sword. Clutching his Zanpakuto in his hands, Hisagi confesses that he's afraid to fight. By the way, quick note, but this is very similar, this panel, to the pose Hisagi takes when he would eventually kill Tōsen at the end of the fight, right down to the closed eyes. But I remember being genuinely surprised that this was the direction Kubo was taking Hisagi's character, turning him from the stoic badass he was in his battle with Findor, and bringing out a real humanity that helped to turn this vice captain into a three-dimensional character. Remember, Hisagi's popularity was skyrocketing during the Fate Karakura Town arc. A single misstep could have put a stop to that. This was a bold turn by Kubo, but I liked it a lot. As Hisagi expects to be removed from his post, Tōsen instead tells him something that will stick with him forever. That fear is the reason why he should be a seated officer after all. Tōsen believed that power wasn't the most important thing for a warrior, but fear. the fear of battle. Tōsen then utters his most famous quote, a quote that helped shape not only Hisagi himself, but acted as the foundation for an entire trilogy of novels. "Those who don't fear the sword they wield are not worthy of holding one." Tōsen told Hisagi on that day that if he's truly afraid of fighting, then he's already acquired something invaluable to a warrior. Interestingly, the hollow that gave Hisagi that scar was one of Aizen's many experiments, so Tōsen is in a way inadvertently responsible for this too. With these words echoing in his mind, Hisagi can't grasp why Tōsen has chosen to go down this path. Why, if power isn't everything, did Tōsen throw everything away for the sake of it? Hisagi is making the same mistake, however, that Komamura did early on, by assuming that everything Tōsen does, every betrayal he's wrought, is purely done out of a desire for strength, power for power's sake. As Hisagi yells at Tōsen, desperate to know what he fears now, a sword is suddenly thrust through his gut. Tōsen callously kicks Hisagi from the end of his blade, sending the vice captain toppling over the side of the building and out of sight. As Hisagi falls, Tōsen rises, revealing he does fear something after all, the same fear he's had for 100 years. Tōsen fears assimilating and dying as a Shinigami, essentially becoming one of them. Revealing this has been his driving force for a century helps to tell us a lot. This is why he was so invested in their holification experiments, why he sees Aizen as a godly figure. It was all for him. That was where it was leading to. As Tōsen ponders this, however, Komamura re-emerges, activating his bankai as the chapter comes to an end with one of my favourite shots of the fight. Komamura facing Tōsen down atop a shattered building, Kokujo Tengen Myo rising up behind him. With his titanic bankai now here beside him, Komamura prepares to face Tōsen in a full-scale battle. Tōsen doubles down, calling bankai a measly power while readying his blade. I do wonder how Suzumushi is taking all of this Zanpakuto and Shinigami slander. When you think about it, that would be a fascinating inner world discussion to be a part of. For over 100 years, ever since becoming a Shinigami and even before, Tōsen has hated them all, hated the thought of growing comfortable with them, hating becoming a part of the machine. Suzumushi almost certainly knew that from day one, and I do wonder if it was difficult for the Zanpakuto, or if they simply accepted it. Komamura and Tōsen prepare to clash as we get an awesome chapter cover featuring Tōsen's grim embrace. The fight then breaks for a few pages to show us what's going on with Shinji and Aizen before quickly returning to the action. It's easy to forget these days, but this battle was the first time we'd ever seen Komamura's bankai in a fully fledged fight. The first time we saw it when he activated it against Kenpachi during the Soul Society arc, their fight was immediately interrupted. The next time we saw it, Komamura used it to kill Po in a single hit. Now though, his bankai is finally being used in a serious duel for an extended period of time, and unfortunately it's a mixed bag early on. Tōsen almost cuts Kokujo Tengen Myo's arm clean off, and we see that it injures Komamura in a similar fashion as well, sending blood spurting into the air. Many of us were kind of hoping to see a new special ability or something from Komamura's bankai to help make it more versatile, but instead Kubo went the opposite direction and gave the giant warrior a huge exploitable weakness. It wouldn't be until the 1000-Year Blood War arc when we'd learn why this connection between Komamura and Tenken was actually so beneficial for the captain. However, Kubo quickly follows that up with an impressive showing for the bankai as well. As Tōsen flits behind Komamura, the captain reacts quickly, and his enormous bankai swings its mighty arm around, catching Tōsen in midair and launching him across the town. Collecting himself, Tōsen muses that Komamura's bankai is an inconvenient one. However, we get to see the damage done by a single successful strike from the bankai's arm, as Tōsen's own arm is completely mangled. This was surprisingly grisly for the Arrancar arc and made me do a double take when I first saw it, as Tōsen's entire limb is mashed to pieces, blood and bone poking and dripping out at every angle. Even his fingers have been split in two in places. Tōsen notes that Komamura probably never imagined a scenario where an enemy might survive his first attack, or if they did, they wouldn't be capable of striking back. Honestly, this line puts into perspective how Kubo feels about Komamura's bankai, that it's so physically immense that there should be very little capable of withstanding even a single hit from it. Basically exactly how it's used against Po earlier in the arc. And yet, before Komamura's very eyes, Tōsen's arm snaps and bends back into place as he uses high-speed regeneration to fix his injuries. I love the ominous shading on the image of Tōsen's restored arm, as if Kubo is saying, yeah, that's right, he's really gone this far. Komamura feels the same way, commenting that Tōsen really isn't a Shinigami anymore. At this point in the fight, Tōsen decides to question Komamura a bit, while letting him into his psyche at the same time. Tōsen asks Komamura what it would mean for someone to join an organisation for the sole purpose of revenge, only to lose sight of that true purpose over time and become complacent, even happy in his new life. Wouldn't that be truly depraved? Tōsen notes that to him, that seems even worse than betraying his friends to acquire the power necessary to exact that vengeance. Komamura then demands an answer. Why did Tōsen join the Gotei 13 in the first place? And Tōsen confirms the worst. Revenge. Taking us back to his flashback in the Soul Society arc, Tōsen reveals the truth, laying his heart bare for Komamura to see. Why would he join the very same organisation that murdered his best friend? Why would he take up arms for the same group that covered up Kakyo's death and allowed it to go unavenged? There is only one reason. Tōsen joined the Gotei 13 with the sole objective of killing it from the inside. But over time, he gained a close friend in Komamura and a trusted student in Hisagi, and began to feel that conviction wavering. Even after committing terrible deeds, like betraying his former captain in the name of his justice, Tōsen grew afraid of this new life. Afraid that he might like and enjoy it better than pursuing and seeing his ambition through to the end. Sadly, Komamura had always chosen to believe the best in Tōsen though, thinking that his friend, although deeply devastated over the loss of his own best friend, had joined the Gotei 13 out of a sense of justice, wanting to honour Kakyo's passion for justice by becoming someone who could safeguard others. When Tōsen agrees, claiming it was for justice, Komamura demands to know then what justice really means to him. Tōsen throws open his arms as his mask begins to change and deform. I've always loved this about Tōsen's hollow mask design. While I remember initially being a little disappointed in how plain it was, the way it began to crack and fracture at the jaw before turning into a mouth complete with rows of teeth honestly made it look really cool and even haunting, as though Tōsen were wearing a skull upon his face. But why is his mask changing before our very eyes like this? Again, this is something we've never seen before, and I think there are a few reasons why it might be happening. The mask is breaking as Tōsen grows more emotional and agitated, as if his raw emotions and instincts are really coming to the forefront. Remember, in Turn Back the Pendulum, Aizen notes that agitation and anger only serve to speed up and amplify the holification process. And so the hate and anger that drove Tōsen down this path in the first place is coming to bear here, and Tōsen's mask is splintering and becoming more animated to show that rather simply sitting upon his face, Tōsen and this power are growing closer and closer as he rants about his deceased friend and their so-called justice. During this dialogue, Kubo makes a point of showing Tōsen's own mouth within the jaws of his mask. This is very deliberate, as it really evokes the appearance of a hollow, who are often shown with a human mouth inside their open jaw. Tōsen has strayed so very far from his original self that he's becoming something unrecognisable. Yet the man he was remains in there somewhere. As Komamura demands to know what justice is to Tōsen, Tōsen turns it back against him, believing Komamura would have him simply forgive his friend's murderer. Oh, wouldn't that be joyous, beautiful, virtuous in fact? But the truth is that virtue isn't justice. And to live a peaceful life without avenging his dead friend to Tōsen would be nothing but evil, vice, immoral, wicked. To Tōsen, that would be the life he would lead were he to abandon his quest. It's at this point Komamura realises they've reached the end. Tōsen is unsalvageable in his current mindset. Forgiveness is a sin in his blind eyes. Blood must be repaid with blood. We get a wonderful shot of a contemplative Komamura hanging his head from afar as he comes to terms with Tōsen's transformation. Lifting his sword, Komamura acknowledges that he's misunderstood Tōsen all this time. Tōsen was right to begin with. They were indeed destined to collide after all. Tōsen scoffs, however, at Komamura's idea of justice. Will Komamura cut him down simply because they don't see eye to eye? Is that really justice? Again, it's a fascinating point. Of course, that isn't really justice, but that's not why Komamura's making this choice. He knows that persuading Tōsen to turn back is impossible now, and that he's become a danger to the Soul Society. It's definitely an interesting place to be. You can see it in Tōsen's monstrous visage that Kubo wants you to side with Komamura and ultimately the Soul Society in this instance, and he is presented as the noble one here. Komamura is a soldier through and through, however, and this takes us back to a point made earlier in the fight. Tōsen said Komamura's view was tainted by a simplistic judgment that viewed all hollows as evil and all Shinigami as good. That's not quite accurate, but Komamura does hold a similar view that perhaps taints his perspective. He, and we, the reader, ultimately view the Soul Society as overarchingly good, even if we know that not to be the case. But it makes sense that Komamura would feel this way about the Soul Society. It, and specifically Yamamoto, took him in when he had nowhere else to go. In the end, that's what makes this fight so special. That's how we've been able to talk for so long. The lines have never been more blurred than they are here. Tōsen is a truly compelling villain in the sense that it's easy to see where he's coming from, and yet the corruption is obvious. And at the same time, the Soul Society isn't as squeaky clean as Komamura would like to believe it is. But currently they are unequivocally doing the right thing. The Gotei 13 has been deployed specifically to protect Karakura Town and its innocent inhabitants. Meanwhile, Tōsen's quest for justice is soaked in blood and has brought him to a place of evil. His association with Aizen and his alignment with his goals makes Tōsen evil, even if he doesn't see it. And so, no matter what you might think about the Soul Society in the grand scheme of things, Komamura is in the right here. As he readies his blade to cut down his friend out of duty, it is a position the reader can, nay, they must get behind. As Komamura notes that his heart has already forgiven Tōsen, thereby giving him the moral high ground against someone who doesn't see virtue in forgiveness, Tōsen continues to stray even further from the light, Kubo covering him in a sinister shadow. Tōsen's twisted mindset is fully revealed as he angrily snarls at Komamura, rejecting his forgiveness and telling him not to talk as if he's a god, as though forgiveness is only reserved for deities. Tōsen tells Komamura to try and kill him if he can, once he's seen his Resurrecciōn. This was another truly shocking moment. Tōsen really has gone further than any Vizard at this point. Though interestingly, it was noted by Kubo recently in Club Outside that the other Vizard could attain Resurrecciōn if they trained hard enough for it. But pointing his Zanpakuto downwards, a shadow completely covering him, making him look pretty cool by the way, Tōsen activates his newfound power with the name Suzumushi Hyakushiki Griya Griyo, before his body explodes in a column of inky black darkness, only his hollow mask left afloat like a sinister skull. It's an awesome visual and an extremely cool moment. The name is interesting too. Despite being ostensibly a hollow ability, the name of Tōsen's Resurrecciōn stems from his Zanpakuto, which would mean he, like Ichigo, has successfully totally fused his hollow and Shinigami powers. As we begin chapter 386, the darkness spreads across the sky like a sickly ooze, cracking and shattering Tōsen's hollow mask as something new and vile is revealed from within the shadows. Tōsen has now become an abomination, a monstrous cricket-like insect beast covered in jet black fur. Hunched over, the creature has 4 gangly arms dangling in front of it, complete with curved, clawed fingers. From its back, 2 massive black horns rise upwards, chains hanging from the sides of each. Sprouting from Tōsen's back are 2 pairs of fly-like wings, while a huge furry tail whips about behind him. Finishing off this horrific transformation is Tōsen's new head. The bottom half of his face now resembles his original human appearance, but the top half has mutated, becoming a grotesque, eldritch bug's head that somewhat resembles his hollow mask. Rings reminiscent of Suzumushi's guard hang from horn-like protrusions above his new bulbous eyes. This form gets a lot of flack from people for turning Tōsen into a fly, but that's a very simple and reductive way of looking at it. While I do think Tōsen's head looks a little ridiculous, the rest of it I actually really like. He looks totally monstrous, but also incredibly unique. The overall bug-like appearance is of course another reference to his Zanpakuto, further showing just how much his powers have indeed become one tangled mess. So, while we don't get to see any of Tōsen's hollowification training, we can assume the form he took as his soul broke down closely resembled this. But the best is yet to come. As Tōsen's enormous eyes crack open slowly, he mutters something astounding. He can see. Tōsen, who has been blind for as long as we've known him, can suddenly see at last. In a very ominous shot with both eyes finally open, Tōsen is ecstatic about at last having vision. But of course, this is just the final nail in the coffin. The Tōsen Komamura and Hisagi thought they knew is well and truly gone now, symbolised by his gaining of sight. In his place is a maniacal lunatic who has turned himself into a monster. With fanged teeth and a huge hollow hole in his chest, Tōsen throws back his head and laughs, unable to believe that sight has come to him at last. This is interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, did the Soul Society not have the technology to give Tōsen sight? I'm sure they probably did, but this highlights the difference between the real Tōsen and this current madman. The real Tōsen never needed sight to be content, while this version gloats insanely about his new gifts. It definitely feels like Kubo is trying to depict Tōsen as someone who has made a deal with the devil here, not yet knowing that it will be his undoing in the end. Fittingly, some of the first things Tōsen sees are blood coming from an injury he caused and the world around him, except it's on fire, smoke billowing from the war zone he's partly responsible for. But in one final, devastating act, Tōsen turns his despicable gaze to Komamura. With a cruel smirk, he notes that Komamura is even uglier than he imagined, causing Komamura's face to fall. Of course, on the surface, there's the irony that Tōsen has become a literal ranting monster, and yet Komamura hasn't said a thing about it. But there's the deeper, sadder implications too. We know that Komamura has always been extremely self-conscious, his appearance having caused him to be ostracised for many years. The fact Tōsen tells Komamura that he's even uglier than he imagined implies that Tōsen has expected Komamura to have a gruesome appearance all this time, even when they were friends. It's meant to be the last wicked action of a man who is truly lost, who is truly trying to sever his final connection to his Shinigami self. And now there's only one thing left to do. Komamura readies himself as Tōsen lunges for him, bringing his vicious claws down in a huge swipe. At this point, we then get the continuation of Komamura and Tōsen's flashback from the Soul Society arc, where Tōsen gives Komamura his answer as to why he became a Shinigami. We see that Tōsen did in fact answer Komamura back then, and so has been lying to him all this time. Well, I guess it was more a half-truth than anything else, but as Komamura is sent flying backwards, he notes that he always figured Tōsen hated the world. Komamura reasoned that anyone who lost a loved one would feel the same way. If anything, Komamura appreciated Tōsen's candid nature. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't or feel a way he didn't. And so Komamura, in light of Tōsen's perceived honesty, endeavoured to become a true friend to him, to help him shoulder his sadness and his burdens, and to help light his way, all so that one day, this man who could no longer love the world might love it again. I mean, I don't feel I need to spell it out for you. This is truly some of Kubo's best ever character work. It's darkly funny that it occurs between two of Bleach's least popular captains, but it really is just that good. Tōsen catches Kokujo Tengen Myo's blade in his hand, cracking it before releasing his final technique, Los Nueve Aspectos, drawing several rings of light in the air in front of him before completely devastating Komamura's bankai with a massive shockwave which barrels into the giant's chest, caving it in. His bankai defeated and his body shattered, Komamura collapses to the floor. The monster that was once Tōsen looms over him like a great shadow. Tōsen prepares to end the fight once and for all, generating 2 lime green Sero in front of him, one before each eye. Tōsen says that justice can't be expressed with words, implying that killing Komamura is the only way forward for him. On the other hand, while Komamura possibly could have kept fighting, he instead relinquishes himself. Apologising to Iba, Hisagi, and even Tōsen, Komamura resigns himself to the fact that he simply can't cut Tōsen no matter what. And so that's kind of interesting too. Earlier, Komamura decided to take up his sword out of a sense of duty to the Soul Society, but even then, the more human side of him shines through, and he can't bring himself to kill his friend, even in the face of imminent death. It appears the fight is all but over. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a sword pierces Tōsen's head from above, skewering him and bursting out of his chin in a shower of blood. Gurgling, Tōsen's eyes swivel upwards to see none other than Hisagi sitting atop him, his sword driven through his former captain's skull. Devastated by what his captain has become, Hisagi breathes that this really isn't Tōsen anymore, as if telling himself that to justify and validate his next move. Closing his eyes in agony, but also a sense of relief for one last strike, Hisagi releases his Shikai inside Tōsen's head, the scythes of Kazushini impaling his captain, one through his mouth, the other through the back of his throat. It's probably one of the single best pages in the entire series, to be honest. Hisagi silhouetted atop the horrific form of his captain, his head bowed. As Hisagi retracts his blade, Tōsen begins to crumble, blood spewing from his mouth. Before he falls unconscious, Tōsen sees his friend Kakyo one last time. She's lying there in front of him, just as he remembers her when he picked up her sword. But something isn't right this time. She's distorted. A thick black shadow is falling over her, as Tōsen suddenly realises he can't see anything at all. It's not that his power has left him. Instead, he's lost his way. Kakyo is gone. She wouldn't like the monster he's become, and in his final moments he's beginning to realise that. Even the object of Tōsen's ambition, his quest for her, has become clouded. Slowly but surely, his eyes open once more. Lying defeated on the ground, Tōsen has mostly reverted back to his original self, though he still has one animalistic arm and his hollow hole left over. Komamura and Hisagi are there, watching over him. And that's another reason why I think Komamura could have possibly kept fighting. Even with his devastated chest, he's still able to move virtually absolutely fine, as we see later when he takes on Aizen. Another testament to the captain's incredible durability. But it's also a nice little reveal as well. Even after their brutal battle, their concern for him is obvious, and it shines through, as they waited for him to wake up once more by his side. As he lies there with blood pouring from his throat, Komamura begins to speak. In one of Bleach's best speeches, Komamura says that while Tōsen always believed they would cross swords, Komamura only came to realise that was likely the truth during their fight. And the same probably went for Hisagi too. But while their relationship had been superficial until now, it was that battle that enabled them to truly understand one another. Komamura has accepted that Tōsen hates the Soul Society, and yes, probably him as well. But he says that he's not asking Tōsen not to hate him or even to set aside his grudge against the Gotei, but to simply try his best to keep his hunger for revenge from changing who he is inside. For just as losing his best friend changed Tōsen forever, the same too would happen to Komamura were he to lose Tōsen. It would leave a devastating hole in his heart. All of this, of course, becomes even more impactful and cyclical in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, almost acting as a direct follow-up to this moment. But for now, it's enough to bring Tōsen to tears. As he thanks Komamura, he turns to Hisagi. Tōsen can still see, thanks to holification, and lifts his hand to Hisagi, wanting to see his face while he still can. It's interesting that Tōsen's eyes are still drawn as being blank here. I suppose he never used to even have irises when he was actually blind, but the fact he doesn't have pupils is also used as a way of expressing that someone is blind in Bleach, as we've seen with Chojiro in the past. But I do wonder what's going through Tōsen's head here. Is he actually repentant, or is he simply grateful for their true friendship? The fact that he cries after Komamura's speech makes me think that he does indeed feel sorry for what's just happened between them. He feels some kind of remorse. He's not necessarily given up his quest for revenge, nor does he necessarily think it was the wrong thing to do, but there's definitely some kind of inherent love between them that even this brutal and sadistic and sad battle couldn't totally erase. As Tōsen tries to look upon Hisagi's face, however, his body suddenly ruptures, exploding in a tidal wave of blood and limbs. Komamura and Hisagi look on in complete shock and horror as Hisagi screams for his captain. Komamura, realising the truth, turns to Aizen and roars at him in a fearsome rage, only for the sky to break apart as Ichigo finally arrives on the battlefield. While the source material never confirmed what happened to Tōsen in this moment, the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World explains that Aizen killed him in a show of mercy. Knowing that his most loyal and devoted servant wanted to avoid becoming content with his life as a Shinigami, he was instructed to kill him should he ever show signs of his conviction wavering. But that's it for Komamura and Hisagi versus Tōsen. This has been a pretty long video, so know that I appreciate you greatly if you made it all the way to the end. I really do think this is one of the best fights, not just of the Arrancar arc, but of the entire series. It has a few minuscule flaws. I think it's maybe a little short considering Tōsen's position within the arc as one of the main villains. It feels a bit like he played second, third, or even fourth fiddle to the Espada, who were just comparatively way more popular. But at the same time, it also feels pretty perfectly paced. It's hard to complain, really. Another flashback for Tōsen would have been nice, something to do with his holification, perhaps. But outside of that, there isn't really much more to say. It's a fantastic, moving, and perhaps above all else, challenging battle that really asks a lot from you as the reader, and I hope I've managed to do it some justice here today. I like that it comes back around again in the future to inform Komamura's character arc too. To be honest, I know I'm a little biased towards Komamura anyway, but I do think he deserved the win here. Technically he does win, but it's Hisagi who delivers the finishing blow. But even that I can't really contest, it's all handled so well. Komamura and Tōsen may not be popular, but I get the feeling Kubo really enjoyed their dynamic and their fated clash, and I mean, that's very obvious here. Anyway, that's it for our latest Bleach battle analysis, guys. I really, really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you like Komamura and Hisagi versus Tōsen? How does it rank for you? How does it compare to its contemporaries, the Espada battles going on concurrently at the same time in the arc? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down below. Who was on the right in this battle, Komamura and Hisagi or Tōsen? Did they both make good points according to you, or was one of them clearly wrong while the other one was clearly right? Do please let me know all of those thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to all of my Patreon supporters. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you like what I do here on YouTube and you want to support me as well, you can do just that to get your name in the credits like this and to get every video I release absolutely ad-free. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.